Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar entitled The Path to US Market for Digital Health Technologies. It's great to see so many of you on the webinar today. To introduce myself, for those of you that don't know me, my name's Kieran Campbell. I'm a content director here at LSX Leaders based in London. I'm delighted to be hosting today's webinar in partnership with MCRA. As with our previous webinars, we have a lot of our own community who are joining us today from around the world, but also a number of those from outside. So before we kick off, I wanted to briefly introduce LSX for those who don't know us. LSX stands for Life Science Executives. We're a community and network of life science decision makers across biotech, medtech, and health tech businesses, pharma companies, the full range of the investor base in life sciences, as well as payers, providers, and other key stakeholders in the healthcare sector. Many people know us from our high-level, large-scale conferences, partnering events, and showcases that we run in both Europe and the US. While these physical events are off the table, we are really pleased to continue connecting people and sharing the expertise of our community through the other arm of our business, virtual partnering and various forms of digital content delivery, such as today's webinar. We are also delighted to be working with MCRA again for today's session, and indeed for this webinar series. MCRA are a leading advisory firm and CRO for the medical device sector with expertise across regulatory, reimbursement, clinical research, healthcare compliance, and quality assurance. They are very much the perfect partners for this series. So today we're going to be focusing on one of these areas specifically, which is digital health regulation and market access. I will very shortly be handing you over to our speakers and presenters for today, Nicole Batista, Associate Director for Cardiovascular and Regulatory Affairs, and Jason Tugman, Associate Director for Cybersecurity, Risk Management and Strategy at MCRA. Nikki is a former FDA Assistant Director in the Cardiac Electrophysiology, Diagnostics and Monitoring Devices Department and has extensive knowledge of digital health, medical device regulation and policy. Jason has over 15 years of cybersecurity experience and is highly experienced within multiple frameworks, as well as FDA pre-market and post-market medical device joint security plan. Now, I'd like to ensure we give a minute or two to allow any latecomers to join before I hand over to Nikki, who will be kicking off today's session. So just a couple of quick points to mention from me before we begin. Number one, we will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation for me to put any questions you may have to Nikki and Jason, and I would encourage you all to please make use of that time to ask any questions or make any follow-ups from the presentation. So please ask your question in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and at the end of the presentation, we'll look to answer as many as we can. And yes, of course, you may send me any questions that you have privately in the chat function if you wish. And number two, if you see a question that you wanted to ask in the Q&A already, you can upvote for that question just to show that you're interested in the answer, and we can look to address those ones first. So please do use this function and ask any questions you have at any point throughout the session. So that is it from me, and I will now hand you over to Nicole Batista with MCRA.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. We're going to talk through how to effectively and efficiently navigate the regulatory requirements for digital health technologies. Again, my name is Nicole Batista. I'm joined here today with my colleague Jason Tugman. As we all know, the digital health market is rapidly expanding as it experiences a 29% annual growth, with only its timeline accelerating with COVID-19 and the demand for remote and telecommunications. By 2025, it's expected that the digital health market will be valued at over $500 billion. If I reflect on the future of digital health, I think I can summarize it in these 6 bullets. I'd only like to highlight a few. The first being biometric monitoring. The power of biometric monitoring is allowing us to get a glimpse into the daily stories our bodies are telling us every day like never before. In order to utilize this data, we have to ensure that there's a seamless integration between digital health technologies and healthcare infrastructures, which must be accelerated in order for digital health technologies to be adopted. And then finally, cybersecurity. It must be a pillar within the design and innovation of digital health, as the healthcare sector accounted for over 40% of all cyber attacks in 2018. This is a critical component to the digital health ecosystem. So for today, we're hoping to tackle 4 targets. First, we're going to talk through how to decide if your device is regulated by the FDA. We're going to talk through the differences between internationally recognized standards and FDA guidances and identify how to overcome those. Then we're going to walk through some of the common challenges and mistakes when drafting regulatory submissions. And then we're finally going to wrap up today's discussion with an overview of the novel paradigm set forth for AI algorithms. So the first question you must ask is my technology regulated by the FDA? And there's 3 main components to determining this. It has to do with the risk associated with your device's use, its intended user, and its intended use. And how you market your technology really determines what regulations and policies apply to your technology. And it's important to recognize that small iterations and modifications to these elements can have significant regulatory impact on your system. I like to think of the regulatory paradigm as a spectrum, where you fit along this spectrum. It's easy to identify the devices that are clearly regulated by the agency, for example, an implanted cardiac monitor. And it's also relatively easy to identify the devices that are not regulated by the FDA, like a general wellness health tracker. What's interesting and more challenging is what we like to call this gray area, where FDA has developed policy and enforcement discretion associated with whether or not your technology may or may not be subject to FDA compliance. So to further this discussion, it's important to ask the question of, is your technology a medical device? So this is twofold. Does your technology meet the definition of a medical device per Section 201H of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act? And the definition is it intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease or condition? And if so, are there any aspects of your technology that are exempt from FDA regulatory oversight, which was put forth through 21st Century Cures Act, where the FDA has defined medical software functions that are not subject to FDA regulatory oversight. So to further illustrate the level of risk, your marketing material, and your intended use, and whether or not where you fit on this spectrum, do you straddle the spectrum in any way, we can take a thermometer example. A general purpose thermometer does not make any sort of medical claims. It does not meet that definition of medical device and therefore is unregulated. But as we continue down this list, we're adding more medical claims and clinical utility claims associated with the thermometer, such that we get to an instance where we might be diagnosing a clinical condition, and now we're fully on that opposite end of the spectrum. Another way to look at your technology is within the buckets that FDA has established for digital health technology. And an important note of this is twofold. There is still, again, this gray area where we have to take a case-by-case analysis of your technology and determine where along that spectrum you fit. And then also, it's important to note that FDA's most recently published guidance related to digital health technology was released on July 29th of this year, which elaborates on multifunction device products. And as you might be thinking about your own technology and recognize that it's not a single component, but you have multiple aspects to your device that fit into a larger device system. And there might be elements of that system that don't meet the definition of a medical device. So what do you do with that? Is that subject to FDA regulatory oversight? Historically, FDA has not looked for any information on these components. However, the policy put forth in this guidance has now illustrated the requirement to at least assess the functionality of these unregulated components of your system and how it may or may not impact the intended use and safety and efficacy of the regulated components. So again, it's important to realize that we start with risk classifications of your system, and there are a number of organizations that have put forth risk classifications, regulatory groups, international standards, and what this schematic is supposed to illustrate is that there are multiple players within the ecosystem of regulatory oversight. There's also each one uses a different nomenclature, and it's your responsibility as a manufacturer to comply with all of these various risk classification systems. When we think about the framework of your regulatory submission, the two organizations from that previous slide that are really imperative is the International Standard IEC 62304 for software lifecycle and the FDA guidance for content in a pre-market submission for software contained in medical devices. And it wasn't until I left the agency and started working with clients to help bridge the process of going from developing software to creating a regulatory submission did I realize that these documents, which are the framework of your submission, the framework of your development, are not created equal. And there are gaps between these two documents that clearly correlate to the common deficiencies that the agency issues. And so one way to look at it is that the standard is the template for device developers, and the guidance is the template for the FDA review team when it comes time to look at your submission. So it is imperative that we identify these gaps and marry the content and objectives of these two documents to have a cohesive and comprehensive submission. So the starting point of your actual FDA submission is determining the level of concern across your system. And this determines the content of FDA pre-market submissions. So much like we highlighted earlier, there's a difference in nomenclature here between the standard and the guidance. However, luckily, the definitions of the different classifications align quite nicely. But it's important, again, this is a perfect example of differences in nomenclature. So this is the starting point of your submission. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Jason to talk about the risk classifications from a cybersecurity perspective.
Great. Thank you, Nikki. So as Nikki said, my name is Jason Tugman, and I'm going to talk to you guys about cybersecurity and really how we define cybersecurity within the context of medical devices. And so to do that, we first have to understand that everything gets down to risk. And Nikki has already touched on this with classifications and tiers and how they're defined. But the question that I get asked the most is, you know, if we're talking about risk to medical devices, why are we talking about guidance and not standards or really regulation? And the answer to that is speed. We all know that cybersecurity evolves very quickly, or rather cyber risks evolve very quickly, cyber threats. So in order to meet that, a guidance document can be put out quickly, and by that I air quoting the word quickly, as opposed to a regulation. And it also defines it allows the FDA to use the language of may or should, not the language of shall. And that allows flexibility to the organizations. But one thing that I always like to point out is even though that language is may, think of the word may as the carrot that can potentially be quickly followed by the stick that is should. So when we see guidance, it isn't, oh, we can, you know, we might be able to do it. No, you should really do it, especially when you're talking about getting through that approval process. And the FDA has said themselves, as this quote says, this is actually from the 2019 kickoff of the workshop for the kickoff of the 2018 draft of the pre-market guidance for cybersecurity and medical devices. And, you know, they recognize that that tempo of guidance is going to, it has sped up and will increase over time as cyber risks evolve and as this, the FDA evolves its understanding and its capabilities of putting out guidance. So when we talk about devices, we have to begin with how the FDA talks about that. And we talk about that in terms of trustworthiness. How trustworthy is a device? So the FDA defines trustworthiness as anything that is hardware, software, programmable logic that, and as you see here, provides reasonable level of availability, reliability, and correct operation, adheres to general accepted security procedures, and more. So if we understand what trustworthiness is, we can then begin to apply appropriate risk-based cybersecurity controls. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So as we, so to do that, now that we understand what a trustworthy device is, Nikki has already shown what a tier 1 and a tier 2 device, or from a risk perspective, is. So a tier 1 is the highest cybersecurity risk. That really has two main criteria. One, it has to be connected. It can be connected via wireless or wired. It can connect to medical devices or non-medical devices. And if a cybersecurity event were to happen to that device, it would affect or directly impact patient harm to multiple patients. Key words there, multiple patients. So if your device doesn't meet that, your device will fall into the standard cybersecurity risk, which is tier 2 risk. Now note the words standard cybersecurity risk, not no cybersecurity risk. And the reasoning for that is that a tier 1, from a guidance perspective, may or really should meet all of the requirements that are in the guidance documents, both for pre-market and post-market. But if you're a tier 2 device, you still have to look at all of those controls and, from a risk-based perspective, justify their inclusion or exclusion from your device and really from your submission. So even though your device might be a tier 2 device, that cybersecurity knowledge still needs to be there, even if it's just there to say that it's not needed. Next slide, please. So in the pre-market guidance, we have all of these components. The only thing that I'm going to talk to you about out of time today is that top right corner, which is tier 1 and tier 2. And I've already touched on this. A tier 1 device, that device that is connected, that can cause harm to multiple patients, must address all of the FDA guidance from a design control. And tier 2 must address all the design controls or provide that risk-based rationale. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, my device is a, say, a class 3 device, therefore I must be a tier 1. We all know that that's not necessarily true. So there exists situations where you might have, say, a class 2 infusion pump that is a tier 1 cybersecurity risk, whereas you might have a class 3 coronary atherectomy, that is a tier 2 device only because it doesn't have connectivity. So just because it is a higher class in the FDA doesn't mean that it is necessarily matching with that tier of cybersecurity risk. Next slide, please. So what we're going to talk about is the total product life cycle. So the FDA looks at that pre-market guidance, getting your device through and accepted, approved by the FDA, and then that total product life cycle going all the way through to the end of that life cycle. So the risks that begin, say, now aren't the risks that might exist in 5 years' time. So in order to address that, one, we have to meet all those requirements in our documentation for submission. But then, as our device evolves in and out into the wild, as it were, it is very common for us to have routine updates and patches to a device. Now, that might be for some cyber risk, that might be for other reasons to patch your device. Nikki later will talk about software updates, and it's very similar. But the FDA recognizes that a cybersecurity, so there can be routine cybersecurity updates and patches, and they likely won't need to go back through the FDA 510K process. But if you have a risk to your device that could be considered significant, that has those significant changes or modifications to that device, then that device will likely have to go back through the FDA's 510K process. And that's documented in the post-market guidance that is put out there. So now we're seeing the pre-market guidance and the post-market guidance working together. So just because your device is through the acceptance process doesn't mean that you're done. So the organizations that have these devices getting them through the approval process need to have an organizational cyber risk management program that supports them, not only just through the approval process, but through that total product lifecycle, to understand risk, to understand the patches and updates and those risk-based classifications of routine or significant update. So the organizations need to have that capability of cybersecurity knowledge, or that cybersecurity risk-based capability within the organization, or work with, say, an organization like MCRA or tons of other organizations that can take that lift from you and look at the devices and help guide through whether a device needs to go back from that post-market into that pre-market 510K approval process. So there's a lot to talk about in cybersecurity and medical devices. We only scratched the surface. There's a lot of topics and a lot of nuance to everything that we've talked about. But what I want you to take away from this is one, what a trustworthy device is, how the FDA thinks about a trustworthy device. So in using the words trustworthy, they're saying that that device through the approval process is not done. It's total product life cycle. It's maintaining trustworthiness all the way through it. And that everything is risk-based rationale. Even though you don't need it, even though you're a tier 2 device, you still have to look at your device and say, here is why we don't need to do this, or we need to do this small handful, but not this main majority. And here's why. Here's our risk-based rationale. So with that, I know that we've got a lot more to talk about in cybersecurity, but I'm going to pass it back to Nikki, and she's going to walk you through all of that documentation and how to organize it through, and I will see everybody back at the Q&A session. Thank you very much. Nikki?
Thanks, Jason. All right, so now that we have a clear understanding of the risk classifications and a good starting point for developing your submission, I want to talk through the critical software documents that are required to meet FDA's expectations. And before I jump into the individual documents and the common mistakes in utilizing IEC 63204 with the FDA guidance to identify the mismatch, I want to address a common question I get, which is, what does the FDA submission practically look like? And fundamentally, it's a bunch of words and pictures that are used to fundamentally connect the dots between all of the data and information about your system to demonstrate to FDA that your device is safe and effective. You're telling the story about your system. You do not send your device to FDA. FDA will not run your code. FDA will not test your device. It is your responsibility with this regulatory submission to bring your system to life. So with that in mind, I want to illustrate and outline how we can connect the dots much more easily for the FDA review team. So the first element I want to talk through is the architecture design diagram. When I start developing submissions, I always start with the device description. And the architecture design chart is truly the legend for this system. And there's two kinds that we like to include in submissions. The technical architecture design chart that outlines the different software units within your system, and then a more macroscopic version to outline how the different components within your system communicate and interact with each other. And the more technical design chart really fits the needs of the standard, and that more macroscopic scale chart facilitates FDA's review and understanding of how your system operates and what its components consist of. So ensuring that you have both is really important. The next critical element is your traceability analysis. And while this is primarily an administrative burden on the manufacturer, it is critically important to the actual regulatory submission. As you can imagine, as you develop all of these documentation, all this documentation to support your system, without a roadmap on how to identify and locate and understand the connection between all of the requirements, FDA can certainly get confused and lead to a very laborious and long review cycle. But if your submission is organized and a traceability analysis is key to this, it can help expedite the review time. The next element is often overlooked, and we want to make sure that this is considered. This is your commercial off-the-shelf software, your open source software, or as FDA refers to it as soup. There's an algorithm that you go through to decide if you have to provide basic or special documentation. And it's important to ensure that this is incorporated in your risk assessment when you're developing the level of risk for your entire system to include any commercial off-the-shelf software. The next element is your device hazard analysis. The standard depicts this as a cycle, which makes sense as we're developing our software, where you identify a hazard, you add in controls, you verify and update as it goes through that iterative cycle. But from FDA's perspective, they're reviewing a finite intended use with functionality that has been locked in place. So FDA views this in more of a linear fashion, and it should be presented in a table format that identifies the risks and walks the reviewer through the risk classification of that, any sort of risk scoring you do, the controlling and mitigating measures and verification of those controls. An important thing to remember, and often a common deficiency in this document, is that folks who are traditionally used to conducting risk assessments per ISO 14971 include both severity and likelihood of occurrence. However, in the case of software, we eliminate likelihood of occurrence and only factor in severity because the failures of software are assumed to be systemic and will occur. The next two documents really go hand in hand, and the first one is your software requirements specification. I like to refer to this as the what of your software document. It tells you what your device is supposed to do. And generally, the standard and the guidance are well aligned. There are a few elements within the FDA standard that they call out that are not called out in the standard, like the programming languages that you use. However, the ultimate goal of this document is to ensure that your requirements are all well specified, detailed, and should be written in such a way that is testable. And every single requirement is linked back to a hazard, such that all hazards have been addressed. The second document that goes hand in hand with your SRS is your SDS, your software design specification. And this was an interesting revelation for me when I was doing that exercise of mapping the two documents. This was one of the most common deficiencies issued by the FDA when I was there. And it's because the standard, which medical device manufacturers and industry uses to develop their software, doesn't ask for it. So it's to no surprise that if you're not looking at the FDA guidance, that you're going to be deficient in this regard. And so when I work with clients and specifically software developers, they ask, why do I need this? And admittedly, it is an administrative burden on the company. However, the goal of it is for FDA to have traceability between the requirements and the functionality of your system, such that this document should either, I've seen it two ways, point to the place within your code or where the operation takes place to meet that requirement, such that the document may not be readable to a layman, it's just code. Alternatively, you can describe how your software functions to meet that requirement. The next important element is your testing, your V&V documentation. And it's important to realize that FDA doesn't specify the types of testing you have to perform for your system. It's your responsibility to determine what's appropriate for your system. And FDA is fundamentally looking for assurance that your device does what it says it does and it meets user needs. Generally speaking, this element goes unscathed. but it's important to realize any claim you make about your system should be accounted for in your testing. And another element here is it's important to realize whatever level of concern you have deemed your system will dictate the level of granularity and detail included in your V&V documentation. And the last, but really certainly not least, element of your submission is your software development environment description. Much like what Jason presented earlier, from a software perspective, it's really broken down into two main components. FDA wants to understand what procedures, standards, and tools you're using to develop your software. So an example would be Visual Studio. Are you using some sort of tools to develop your code? And then secondly is your procedures for change management and configuration management. And this really gets employed in the post-market space after FDA has cleared or approved your system. And there are some important considerations for this element that are common deficiencies I see. The first one is that you don't include your configuration or change management policies and procedures in your submission, or it's incomplete. Sometimes it doesn't include important elements of how you're controlling your commercial or open source software, how you're working with that vendor to ensure any changes made by them are being vetted and controlled for the deployment of your devices, and also considerations from a regulatory perspective. FDA has issued a guidance that outlines the types of changes you can make with or without FDA regulatory oversight, and often these procedures don't consider the regulatory impact of some of these changes. So hopefully over the last few slides, you've gained some appreciation that the documents generated by international standards organizations and the FDA do not overlap perfectly as much as we would like them to. And it's imperative that we identify the differences so that our regulatory submissions are comprehensive, and what we like to say is you get it right the first time. So with that all in mind, I'd like to kind of take a step back, think about where we've been, where we're going for digital health, and spend some time talking about the evolving paradigms for novel software like artificial intelligence. So much of what we've talked about so far in terms of the policy that FDA has put forth has been a consequence of the legislation of 21st Century Cures Act, which was enacted in 2016, which paved the pathway for innovative and disruptive technologies to gain patient access early and soon. And so FDA, as I mentioned earlier, developed a bunch of enforcement discretion policies, redefined how medical device software functions fit within their paradigm. And that led to the creation actually at the agency for a digital health unit that is 100% devoted to developing framework to support the creation and innovation that we're seeing in the digital health space. So FDA put forth an action plan which included a number of policies and potential pathways to market, which they are currently in the development of and refinement of some pilots that they were conducting. And what's interesting is that FDA recognizes that the pace of software innovation and iterative changes is so much faster than traditional medical devices. It truly needs its own regulatory pathway. So traditionally we look at our PMAs, our 510Ks, our de novos. Those review cycles are really long, and we have an industry where changes can happen and be tested and deployed so quickly. How can we fit? There's no real good fit within what is currently being used. So FDA put forth a total product life cycle paradigm, and I'd like to take the next few moments to walk through how that could apply to AI algorithms. So I really like this schematic from the Medical Futurist, and it provides a timeline, which likely needs to be updated because there has been a lot of activity in this in the last 2 years. But what I like about it is it shows you that, first of all, FDA is clearing and approving artificial intelligence-based algorithms. And the primary drivers are within radiology. Medical device imaging is truly leading the field and leading FDA in their development of how to regulate artificial intelligence. So it's important when you're thinking about your system, if you have AI techniques utilized in your device, look to radiology, see what they're doing, understand the pathways they've been taking, as it does have important implications how the rest of the medical device disciplines are following suit. So it's important to distinct locked AI algorithms from adaptive AI algorithms. And for those, this likely is just a refresher or something you talk about all the time, but to briefly define, locked algorithms are those in which when you have an input after so many trials, the output does not change. You may have used AI techniques to develop your algorithm, but it is locked at the point in which you commercially distribute the device. On the other hand, we have adaptive algorithms where at the point of deployment to patients, over time, that output is going to change because it's learning. And it's important to realize that generally speaking, most of those devices that were in that last schematic were locked algorithms. The only ones that I'm aware of that are adaptive are in the medical device imaging space, and that's why we need to look to medical device imaging companies and their experience to really guide us through the regulatory paradigms as it's really setting waves within the agency. So again, total product lifecycle approach, much like the pilot set forth for software as a medical device, which is a much more general umbrella. There are four main components. The first three are generally in line with what we would be used to in the traditional medical device space, with only the fourth one in terms of utilizing and leveraging the post-market space, given the uniqueness of how software interacts with its users. So I just want to briefly walk through each four of these elements. So much like good laboratory practice or good manufacturing practice, FDA is promoting the use of good machine learning practices. And these are industry standards, as many of us know, which really starts with relevant and quality data, quality handling of data, that is ensuring that your training data sets do not overlap with your testing data sets, such that we produce high quality validation of your system. The next element is, to no surprise, your pre-market review. There's two elements of this program that I really want to highlight because they're really interesting, and it really gets to the point of, okay, so I have this adaptive algorithm. It's going to be changing over time. FDA is not used to things just changing. Typically, you have to submit that change to FDA. For AI, now they've defined a software as medical device pre-specification document and an algorithm change protocol. And I'd like to draw the parallels between what we talked about previously with your SRS and your SDS. These are your what and your how in terms of AI. So your SPS is essentially drawing a boundary around what can be modified from the baseline state of your algorithm after it's been deployed to the market. So you're predicting the changes in performance inputs and intended uses, and you're submitting that to the FDA, and FDA is giving you the nod that, okay, if your algorithm can meet these specifications and improve performance, we're okay with you launching that product without coming to us. And this is important to do according to your algorithm change protocol. Again, it's all with ensuring that you're utilizing well-defined procedures with a high level of transparency with the agency, because they need to answer the question of their mission of protecting and promoting public health. And they need some level of transparency with what you're doing, but they also recognize that we don't want to stop the utilization of AI given its power and its potential impact on healthcare. These, again, are the three types of changes which I briefly mentioned that you can specify in your documentation related to performance, inputs, and intended uses. So lastly, the increased transparency and the shift from pre-market to post-market, which is a trend we're seeing across the agency. It's unique to software in that software can capture a lot more data about its users depending on its interface and how it's intended to be used. So FDA realizes that maybe we can shift these data collection, and in order to allow for these post-market changes to be implemented, what can we ensure is taken or recorded and documented by the manufacturer to ensure that we're still meeting safety and efficacy metrics for your system. So post-market data collection, to ensure that you need to include mechanisms and procedures and outline what you're going to do. This is your change protocol. This is what's going to happen once you've deployed that. You also have to think about interoperability. If your device is working with other systems, how is the changing specifications, performance, etc., impacting the devices within the ecosystem in which they're working with? You also need to be conscious of any labeling updates required to ensure that any changes implemented through your SBS or ACP have been well communicated with your users. And finally, FDA does not necessarily say you can make any change you want. There are certain changes where you do have to submit back to the FDA. Hopefully with a well spelled out procedure in place, that review can be quick, which I think is the ultimate goal with the agency, recognizing that the longer they take to review, the slower these iterations get to the public. But it's also important to inform your collaborators, your public, etc. So with that, we've talked about a lot of things. It's an exciting field to be in, and what I'd like to conclude with is 6 big take-homes that will ultimately help you with a more efficient and effective regulatory process. So the first is to ensure that you understand how your device fits within the regulatory spectrum, understanding those factors. The second is in being able to classify your technology from a risk-based perspective so that you're providing the level of documentation required by the agency. Third, as Jason has highlighted, cybersecurity is a critical element to the design process, and not just pre-market, but it is a TPLC element that does not stop after device clearance or approval. Next is, it's important to explore all potential pathways that your technology might fit in. The 21st Century Cures Act really established an umbrella of device types. And so it's important to see where within, if your system is a multi-function system, where those different components fit in. Hopefully it's become very clear that it's critically important to comply with all international standards and FDA guidances so that you identify and address the gaps between the two. Again, if you just develop your documentation to comply with IEC 62304, you're not going to cross the finish line. And lastly, regulatory considerations must be made throughout the total product lifecycle of the device. This is highlighted by your configuration change management procedures and et cetera. So hopefully all of these things have been clear. This talk has been really helpful. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen to kick off some Q&A.
Thank you very much, Nikki, and thank you, Jason, as well. That was fantastic. We do have quite a few questions, so let's try and get to as many as we can in the time that we have remaining. Patrick Maguire has asked what I think would be a good question to kick us off. From a regulatory standpoint, what makes AI-driven tech unique in healthcare?
Right, so I think what I just highlighted here is if we're utilizing adaptive algorithms and techniques, FDA is used to having a well-defined device with an intended use and performance specifications that do not change over time. And the power of AI is that it can learn in real time. So how do we regulate products that are constantly changing without removing it from the field and redeploying it? So hopefully with these new policies and programs that FDA is utilizing, and we've learned from medical device imaging, that we can harness and actually leverage the power of AI in healthcare.
Fantastic, thank you. And Hamish Graham has asked quite a specific question. He's wondering, what is the definition of harm in the context of cybersecurity? So, for instance, the example he's given, would a data leak exposing a device or someone's location be defined as harm?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the FDA defines harm as a physical injury or damage to health. AMI 14971 goes a little bit further and defines patient harm, including what I just said, to include damage to property or the environment. So in that context, it wouldn't include data. Obviously, data is covered in HIPAA, which is a separate piece, and obviously a very important piece that should be considered. But specific to cybersecurity and the Tier 1, Tier 2 classifications, we are looking at patient harm being physical injury or damage to the health of the patient.
Awesome, thank you. Hopefully that was helpful to Hamish. Elliot Turini has asked, where does compliance with the MDR cybersecurity regulations to take effect in May 2021 come into play?
Right. So it got delayed. I think we all are familiar with that. It got delayed because of COVID. So where does it come into play? It comes into play, obviously, where when your device goes internationally. I have not done nor seen a direct mapping yet to the MDR to the FDA guidance. There's actually a really great conference this weekend that has Suzanne Schwartz from the FDA talking specifically about that. So if you email me, I can send you the link to that. I will actually be attending that because it's going to answer a lot of my personal questions about that interplay of MDR to the guidance documents. But as we know, we have until 2021, May 2021. It was supposed to be 2020, but now it's 2021 for compliance. So that's a non-answer, but we're all learning.
Awesome, that's great, thank you very much. And Tommaso Frigerio has asked, how do you think about the actual user ceremony internet experience? Do you think that it could be the same one for a user patient, or do you think it could be better to start speaking about a new person ceremony internet experience? I'm not sure if you have the answer to that right now. Might be one to take away.
Yeah, email me that question. I'm maybe not following that as well as I should.
Yeah, that might be a better one to maybe discuss off the webinar afterwards. We can put you in touch, hopefully. So Meryl Weber has also asked quite a high level, but I think certainly worth asking a question in the context of the discussion. How do you actually define digital health?
That's a great question. And much like beauty, it changes depending on who you talk to. It's funny, if you search FDA's website, I can't find a definition for digital health. They talk about it, but there's no actual definition. So I like to take a really broad umbrella approach where it's the convergence of technology and medicine. Some people refine it into something more, but because we can talk about digital health as regulated and non-regulated products, I really like to create that umbrella where it's just leveraging the power of technology to advance healthcare. That's how I would define it.
Great. An old question, but a good one. Now, Shawnee Karkinen has asked, the FDA is saying that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility between manufacturer and the user organization. Where is that borderline? So which part belongs to manufacturer and which to the user organization? Andy has requested, if possible, that examples could be helpful in this.
Yeah, so that's the ball game, right? That is like welcome to the ball game. So with the new guidance, a key component and the thing that really got me the most excited about the new guidance is the CBOM. And I said the word earlier and I drove right by it because it is a larger topic, but the CBOM is the Cybersecurity Bill of Materials. And what that is intended to do is break the black box of the device so that the purchaser, and I will just say the HDO, the hospital, but it could be any number, but I will use this case for the example, the HDO, the hospital, they can understand what is in there, what software is in there, what version is it running Java, if so, what version, all of those things, so that they can understand the device, understand their network and its interplay. It's also a way for the manufacturers to say, we have this control, and this control, which is, and you have this, and this. Or more specifically, we're doing this, you do whatever else you think needs to be done, but we're defining to you what controls we have in place, right? And that is a big reason why when we look at that pre-market guidance that we've got tier 1 and tier 2, even if you are that tier 2 device, you have to supply that risk-based rationale for all of those touch points within the guidance, because that would go into the CBOM, and that is the communication or a piece part of the communication to that HDO. So a specific example very quickly, device in an operating room, spinal, let's go with spinal, right? A spinal device, so it's, but they've got the cart in the operating room that's got connectivity back to say the manufacturer. It goes through the network, so there has to be a trust there. So it has to know what protocols it's using to transmit that data to and from, so you can establish trust. Two-way firewalls. We have a firewall on our side, you have a firewall on your side, please do. Protects the hospital, it protects the network. And then in defining those ports and protocols, they can close or open just the appropriate ports on say just a firewall. That's one very quick example. But if you look at ransomware, that is an important thing of ports and protocols and defining them and helping that data get out of the surgical room, through the hospital network, into the manufacturer, and back again for say imaging or anything like that. So that's CBOM, and that is the whole thing, is that handshake.
Fantastic,
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And one more we have here, again, regarding the FDA. So as the FDA continues to refine and evolve its AI regulations for medical devices, what would you say companies should be doing to make sure that they remain in compliance?
It's a really broad question. I think that much like cybersecurity, we're not going to see any clear-cut regulations specified that call out AI. I think it's important that we keep tabs on what is being cleared and approved. But much like every other software as medical device, you comply with all of the guidances and regulations and standards. I don't, until we have a finalized regulatory platform and paradigm for AI, will we understand the nuanced and distinguishing requirements for these types of algorithms.
Great, thank you. Thank you. We have one other question here that I think is interesting, since it's a little bit more, I guess, therapeutically specific. What is the, well, actually, where are regulations headed, and how do they need to evolve to accommodate AI technology, specifically in orthopedics?
So that is quite specific. I think, like I just said, I don't know if we're going to see specific regulations. And it's important to distinguish regulations from FDA guidance. I think it's much more likely that we'll see a guidance come out from the FDA that finalizes and solidifies this regulatory paradigm. In terms of specific medical disciplines, I think something to note is, per that schematic from the medical futurist that I highlighted, there are some medical disciplines that are a little behind in terms of AI applications, and that's a direct reflection of the review experience from FDA in this space. So radiology is going to be much more savvy in navigating what questions to ask when you submit to the agency. So I think it's going to be a learning curve across the different review teams as we see more of these come in. I'm not too familiar with many in the orthopedic space, but again, there's value in applying it to across medical disciplines.
Awesome, thank you. And one anonymous attendee is asking here about data privacy and patient consent, specifically in the context of AI algorithms. So how does data privacy and patient consent work for personal data being used to train AI algorithms?
Right, so it's an interesting paradigm when we think about when and where HIPAA compliance applies to us, considerations from the EU for GDPR and things like this. And Jason can touch on this a little more from a cybersecurity perspective, but from a patient consent perspective, it's a fascinating handshake right now because, as you know, HIPAA was enacted in the 1990s, reinvented in 2009 to account for electronic health records, but nothing has really been developed in terms of how the handshake between the actual user and the manufacturer. So not until the covered entities or the business associates handle that data do these regulations come into play. And there has been a call out for Health IT, which is an organization under HHS, to establish and better regulate this handshake. So currently, it's TBD, and it's an important element to consider when you're developing your devices to ensure that you have the proper procedures in place to protect any sort of patient data once it does enter into HIPAA compliance. But it's a fascinating world right now with when it's just interaction between the patient and the manufacturer. Jason, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, we brought up MDR earlier. A big component of the MDR is the European Data Bank of Medical Devices that is going to include patient data. So there's going to be an interplay there with GDPR that you mentioned, and that data bank for medical devices. So within that MDR, there are additional things to consider specific to AI if that use of that data goes out and is really related to both MDR and GDPR.
Thank you, that's fantastic. And we do have time for just one further question. This is from Ingrid Bratt, it's just come in. So how does this apply for developing a service using AI? The customer only gets the result delivered and does not use the actual AI as a software. Does the in-house software need to be controlled by the FDA, or does it depend on the level of validation and verification?
So again, it comes back to the question of, does that service meet the definition of a medical device? And if so, are there any aspects to its intended use, its risk, its intended users that might fit within some of the enforcement discretion policies? So generally speaking, FDA is focused on software as medical device, not as software as service, but you'd really have to do a case-by-case assessment of whether or not the service you're providing meets some sort of medical function.
Brilliant, thank you. And that is, I'm afraid, all that we have time for today. So thanks very much to you all for joining us. And again, a huge thank you to both Nikki and Jason for sharing their expertise with us all today. As mentioned, we will be releasing the slides to all attendees. And I'm sure Nikki and Jason will be really happy to discuss the content of the presentation and any ways that they may be able to help you or your businesses after the webinar. We did actually have quite a few questions that sadly we couldn't get to, so maybe strongly recommend you guys get in touch if there is something you're still wondering about. We will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who's registered as soon as possible. That will include a link to the full recorded webinar. On the 15th of September, MCRA will also be delivering an exciting and closely linked presentation at the LSX Health Tech Leaders virtual partnering event, which is taking place across the 15th to the 18th of September. So for more content like this, do be sure to sign up and listen in. Thanks again to everyone for joining us. Thank you very much to Nikki and Jason, and see you all again soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.